Well, today's Sunday, October 22nd, and week 3 is just about wrapping up here. Amy and I had a pretty good week 3. I saw a really good 12-pointer, and I want some help later in the video. I think the 12-pointer that I saw here a few days ago is not the buck that I was thinking was from last year that I had nicknamed Pickett. So we'll get into that a little later in the video. But just last night, Amy saw a shooter buck, and so we're seeing better activity, increased activity, both on our cameras and with our daily sits of just deer movement in general, and of 2 and 3 and 4-year-old bucks and mature bucks. Every day it's getting better. For us, so far, the bed to feed pattern generally in the area has been on cut corn, seems to be drawing some deer, and then alfalfa. So I did a video, was it yesterday or the day before, on a card pull that I had, and I talked about destination food being a prime alfalfa field. And I don't plant alfalfa fields for destination food sources. I want my habitat and my food sources to peak in November, and that's all about protecting and growing big bucks. But the majority of my green food plots are really not destination food plots. But here at home and at my cabin farm, there's really nice alfalfa fields on the neighbors that really draw a lot of deer, and that actually acts as the destination food source. And I can't compete with that, and I'm choosing not to compete with that. It would be very time consuming and not very cost effective for me to try and compete with a 20 or 30 acre lush alfalfa field. So I just set those farms up as a bed to feed pattern when I can. On my cabin farm I can do so. Around home here, the lush alfalfa is way back to the northwest from where we are, 3/4 of a mile away, and I can't set really up a bed to feed pattern on that alfalfa. But when that gets a couple really good hard frosts and the neighbors start hunting a little bit more aggressively, they'll come off of that alfalfa. They do every year, and I think you should expect to see similar results if you're competing with alfalfa fields anywhere you're hunting. I want to circle back after I go through the footage of this last week. During that footage, I also want you to pay attention to this buck I called Pickett and whether or not he is the buck from last year. And then in the comments, if you have an opinion, I'd like to hear it. Because I'm on the fence on whether or not it's that deer from last year. And then I'm also want to circle back. You should be seeing increased activity where you hunt, both on your cameras and with your hunts. You should be seeing increased activity every day of the season, all the way through October, and it should peak in the rut in November. And if you're not seeing increased activity, there's some pretty viable reasons for why that's not happening. And I'd like to cover those because I think some people are already getting into this period in October where they're seeing fewer and fewer deer on their hunts and on their property. And there's some pretty good reasons why that probably is happening. So we'll circle back to that at the end of the video footage from this last week.
So week 3, Amy and I just tried to bounce around as much as we could. This is a neighbor's property. I'm doing a scan here. This is just a funnel. It sets up really good for a west wind. We had a pretty good heavy west wind, so I wanted to get in here and check this stand out. Kind of a first sit type of thing. And that's about all I saw that night. Nice masked bandit here. And then I think I did see some does and fawns later that evening out on the cut beans. I apologize for the shaky footage there. I was freehanding that. So this is behind the house. This is an observation sit. That blind right there is set up for late muzzleloader. You can see my corn is off. That bottom is planted in mostly switchgrass. And right here is kind of a fence jump. It's hard to see. And I filmed this nubber, this button buck, because this is the button buck that Amy orphaned here a week ago or so. And you can pretty much go behind the house and see him every single night. So I just can't stress enough, when you see a buck fawn and a doe, if you harvest that doe, you greatly, greatly increase the chance that that buck fawn's going to make it, and he's going to stick around. Our little buck just came through the fence jump. Um, Nothing spectacular. Just wanted to point out there's a fence jump right there, kind of where that brush pile was. So a bunch of does and fawns I saw that night coming out of my, I would say out of my habitat. That's how I would describe that. Um, just trying to make it as thick as I possibly can in my bottom ground. I cut a lot of the honey locust out. I did a bunch of hinge cutting of box elder down in there. Got some switchgrass growing up in there. This is a long ways away, so I apologize for the footage. Again, this was an observation sit, but right where you see that green, that's winter rye. But I seeded a bunch of acorns in a little strip right along that switchgrass. And there was deer eating in that rye. Again, they're coming out of that switchgrass along that edge, feeding out in that cut corn. And that's typical. When corn comes off, that'll actually congregate deer better in your habitat. So I did see this mature buck. He doesn't have a huge rack. I mean, it's a nice buck, don't get me wrong. You can see it's a big mature deer, though. Probably a 4-year-old. Again, this is 300 yards away, trying to film this. He came out of my bottom switchgrass, where those hinge cut trees and stuff are. And then he also came out on that cut corn. Right now, he's probably 250 yards away. That's perfect observation distance. 250, 300, 350 yards. Close enough where with your binoculars you can see what's going on, but far enough away that, they're not going to see you, smell you, hear you. That's good observations, sit distances. So I hope I don't bore you to death with this footage. Again, he's way out there on that cut corn. And he ended up just, out feeding in that corn the rest of the night until it got dark. This is my access to a different stand that I call North Fence Jump. There's a couple stands in here. Set up really good for a south wind. My access is through that cow pasture. But there's a brushy fence row right here I'm trying to film for you. It's also an inside corner. There's also a fence jump, and there's also a ditch crossing. So it's got 4 really good things going for it. And on this night, I'm kind of using it for an observation sit, but I'm also hoping maybe a doe comes through this little inside corner. And I ended up getting skunked. I didn't see nothing in there that night. So here I'm on that pond again. I had some pretty good action on that pond spot. So, my goal is 5 to 7 days off between sits. And so we had a good northwest wind. I was able to sneak into this this pond stand. And so far, probably my best sit of the year. I can't stress enough, when I go in deep into my cover, I want it to be windy. And that'll really help me get in. But I saw a ton of deer. And I'll kind of talk about this as we watch this footage. I saw a ton of deer that night. A lot of them came to the corn. And I found out later in the evening, a lot of the deer were nervous. Well, we'll circle back to that. So this is that buck that I think might be Pickett from last year. He's a mainframe 12. And, just if this was a 4 or 5-year-old buck, to me, he'd have a little bit more mass. He does have pretty good big shoulders. But he came in and he was by me for an hour. So I tried to really condense the footage down. I hope it doesn't bore you to death. But he worked this scrape. Like just about every buck that comes into this pond works this one scrape. He's on the opposite side from where I'm at. So right now he's probably, 50 yards from where I'm at. But beautiful 12-pointer. But I just don't know if it's the same buck from last year. And the reason why I say that, and he might be, because I'm looking for your opinion if you're willing to comment. I tried to zoom in and get a real good look at his rack. Just a straight up 12-pointer. But to me, that doesn't look like the body of a 4 or 5-year-old buck. He's got a nice big rack, but it just doesn't look like that's the body of a 4 or 5-year-old. And I might be wrong. I don't know. I really struggled with it that night. So as I'm filming right now, my camera's on a tripod, and I'm looking with my binoculars, so I'm doing the best I can to just try and figure out if this is the buck that I think he is from last year. So coming up, I got some footage of him. Um, the only footage I have of him from late muzzleloader. But anyways, as we watch this, I'll kind of circle back. A lot of the deer that I saw in this stand on this night were nervous, and they came from a direction I didn't expect them to come from. And then when they came from my west, which is where I did expect them to come from, they were really nervous, and some of them were even kind of like running, and I couldn't figure out why until at night when it got down, the wind actually died down, and I was sneaking out and doing everything I could to just keep quiet. And from that same direction, where a lot of these deer seemed like they were nervous, came another hunter on the neighbor's property, and I could see him 100 and probably 100 yards from the fence line on his property. So that it's not an issue of hunting too close to the fence line or anything like that, but just busting and cracking, and his headlamp is going, and I think he might even fell over one time. So this is, so I'll circle back to that a little bit. So this is that buck I nicknamed Pickett. This is last year late muzzleloader. So is that the same buck that you just watched on the water hole? Part of me says yes. He wasn't a real big deer last year either, I guess. So part of me says that's the same deer, and I'm hoping it is. And if it is, I'm going to target him. So last year he was 6 on his right, 5 on his left. I think he had like uh, a double fork brow on one side or something like that. So this is the buck I called Pickett, and I was thinking that that was the same deer. And I'm just not so sure. I'm not saying he's not, but I'm just not so sure. His antlers last year, too, were a lot like darker and heavier and stuff around the bases, and this year they're just not as much like that. But if you got an opinion on it, let me know. But yeah, circling back, so the neighbor came walking out by that pond, and he's going to burn his property out, um, if it's not already burned out. So that's kind of a mistake that hunters make, is they go right in the center of their property. That's where all the sign is. That's where the rubs and the scrapes and stuff are. Maybe that's where they think they're bedding. So they go right to the center of their property. But boy, a couple sits and I guarantee you he's going to have his property burned out. And I was watching him, so I just got down on my knees. It's pitch black at this point as he's walking out. And I was just shaking my head and watching him. As he's walking out, he's actually walking through some bedding areas on his property. And I just know this because when I'm hunting this permission farm, I know that that's where some of the deer are bedding, and he's walking right through them. So he probably walked right through them on the way in too. So and then he wonders why he doesn't have why his farm is burned out. We'll get to that later in this same video, which is kind of ironic. But so this is Pickett. He ended up just walking away, walking up the hill there, and I'm assuming out to corn. Boy, he's a beautiful buck though, isn't he? That was an exciting hunt. So I thought I was done seeing him for the night. And again, at this point, I don't even know if I want to shoot him. I was probably 75% I'm going to kill him because I thought it was Pickett, but 25% of me wasn't really sure. I just really didn't know what to do. Yeah, it was a good night. So what I thought was kind of unique is he walked off. I shut the camera down, and moments later, this little buck came in using that same scrape, that same licking branch by the water. Got a little bit to drink there. And then just moments later, that 12-pointer came back. Now, I don't have the camera obviously running for a 4-hour sit for 4 hours, so I guess you'll have to take me at my word. But when that buck started using that scrape, I saw some movement and stuff, and I didn't have the camera like running yet. And this Pickett buck just came right back down that hill, right to this water hole. And that littler buck is to the left now. Yeah, you can just see it on the left side of the frame there. But he did not like that. He just didn't like the fact that little buck went in that scrape. I've personally never seen that before, where a bigger buck would you know, and I want to say he charged right back in, and he kind of did. He just didn't like it. But he kind of settled back down, and then both of these bucks just used that scrape. And like I said, they were by me pretty much all night. So as this is going on is when all these does and fawns and other bucks pretty much where you're looking right now would be like straight behind me and to my left are nervous and kind of running around and just, I knew something wasn't right, but I never put two and two together until I got down and my neighbors started walking out. So that's typical on this farm is the neighbors really overhunt their property every year, which is what makes this permission farm so good. Amy and I just try to stay as passive as we can on some of these farms and let the neighbors pressure the deer so that they'll end up, kind of coming into our properties that we can hunt. And then our hunting gets just better and better and better. It gets better after the fall harvest, and it gets better and better after the other neighbors put a lot of pressure on them and push them in during the archery season. So this is Pickett right in front of me again. And that's about as close as he got, 35 yards. I probably could have slipped in a shot in a little earlier than that. And you gotta understand that camera's down at my waist right now, so it's got a little bit different view than what I could get, let's say, if I was standing up. But pretty fun, exciting night to have, in theory, one of the bucks that I'm hunting, in, my zone, I would call it. And there he goes. So this is the next night. I'm hunting a neighbor's property. And this is when this is standing corn. So I'm going to pan here. You're going to see beans out there. When this is standing corn, this is the legitimate big buck killing stand because they'll use these draws and these waterways and these ditches. Oh, here the doe busted me. This is always what you want to see every time you go out hunting. If this happens to you, you know you're doing the right stuff. Not really. She must have saw me getting up and getting dressed and like getting my gear out and stuff. But anyways, when that's standing corn, these draws and ditches and things are full of deer because that corn acts as visual barriers and sound barriers for the deer. So they just love those types of areas. But when it's beans, it's not uncommon to get skunked in this stand. But I'm going here because I want to hunt as much as I possibly can, but I'm not going to go back to the same stands over and over and over again. I'm going to mix it up. I'm going to have that slow play, passive type hunting throughout the season. And like I just said, the neighbor's going to, burn his farm out by the end of October. And then Amy and I will have some really good sits in some of our farms. But yeah, this doe is having nothing of me. This is later that night. Again, doe coming through. But yeah, I hunt a lot of these observation sits, even though I know my chances of killing a buck on that night, this night are very low. I'm okay with that because I get my tree stand time. So I love being out hunting, but I'm not burning out my properties at the same time. What do we got going on here? Is there a deer in that frame? I think there might have been a doe or something up in those cut beans, and I was trying to get it there, but I probably couldn't get it. So here I wanted to show you real quick. This is another observation sit I'm going to hunt. That's the alfalfa that's northwest of our house, and that's how far away it is. It's really far. And I'm a quarter mile. When I'm filming this right now, I'm a quarter mile from our house, and it's another half a mile or 3/4 of a mile. So here I'm doing another observation sit. And so now I'm about a half a mile from that alfalfa. This is that same spot I went back-to-back nights. So you might say, well, wait a minute. You said you're supposed to give your spots 5 to 7 days off. And that's true. I don't care in this specific area if I burn this spot out. I'm kind of giving it up, and that's okay.
So I hope you enjoyed the footage that I took from this last week. Unfortunately, I'm not there to film all of Amy's sits, and she had a couple good sits, and specifically last night she either saw a worm or a gummy right here behind the house with some does feeding on cut corn. But I wanted to cover, if you're not seeing increased activity on your farm, on your cameras, every time you go out, you sit, you hunt, you should be, on average, you should be seeing increased activity. And I got some notes here, I want to cover them. But the main reasons, I think there's like 4 main reasons. And the first is your habitat is not peaking at this time. So a lot of times farms will have really, really good habitat for, let's say, May, June, July, and August. They'll have really good summer food, really good summer habitat, but they'll peak. So the attractiveness of their farm will peak in the summertime, and then after you start getting some frost and the leaves start to drop and the soybeans start to turn yellow and different things of this nature, the habitat of your farm will actually get worse compared to a neighbor's farm. So I always try to set up my habitat on my hunting properties when I can so that they peak in October, November, December, and early January, because that's when the hunting season is. That's when I want to attract deer to my property, hold them on my property, and protect them so they can grow to the next year, next age class. So that's one reason. Your habitat is peaking in the summertime and it's not peaking in October, November, December. The second thing is I like to supplement my habitat with food plots. Again, if you're planting food plots that peak in June, July, and August, and September, and you're not planning for the fall harvest and you want your food plots to peak in October, November, December, that could be a reason why you're starting to drop off in attractiveness and holding power on your property and you're seeing less deer because your neighbors are planting food plots that are peaking in the fall months. I really think number 3 is probably the biggest reasons, or the biggest reason why your farm, where you're hunting, you could be seeing less and less deer now as we get toward the end of October, and that's hunting pressure. So as you go in, and as you go in and out of your stands and you're hunting and deer are getting downwind of you and they're seeing you and you're bumping deer, and even if you're not bumping deer on the way in, you're not bumping deer while you're on stand, and when you're coming out, so your entrance and your exit, even if you're not bumping deer then, but you're leaving a ton of scent behind, and you repeatedly hunt the same stands over and over, the deer will end up avoiding your farm. So hunting pressure is 100% in your control. In theory it is. Now I get it if you're hunting with a group of guys, or you're hunting on grandpa or grandma's farm, and there's other people hunting there, so there's only so much under your control. But that's a big reason why farms start to see less activity when you should be seeing more. You should be seeing better activity on average every day of the hunting season up until the peak of the rut. If you're seeing the opposite, it's likely because of habitat, food, or hunting pressure. The fourth is really kind of the same, habitat, food, and hunting pressure, but even if you're doing a really good job on your farm, if your neighbors are doing a better job, they're going to have the lion's share of the deer activity and the deer movement. So you're always competing, especially on small properties. If you have a couple thousand acres, well then it doesn't really matter. You can kind of get away with a lot. But if most hunters are 40, 80, 120 acres, 30 acres, and if you're competing with a landowner that's maybe a half a mile away or a quarter of a mile away, or maybe several that have better fall habitat, better fall food plots, they're putting less hunting pressure on their deer, or on the neighborhood's deer, they're going to end up getting the better activity and the better deer movement toward the end of October and in November. So that's something that's probably under your control in many cases. So thanks for watching. Week 4 is coming up. This last week of October, traditionally for me, has been a really, really good week for taking big bucks. I've shot some of my biggest bucks through the 25th, 26th of October up until November 1st. And it's because these bucks are still on a bed to feed pattern, so they're fairly, I don't want to say easy, but they're easier to pattern because it's really hard to pattern a deer in the middle of the rut. But because their activity level just keeps growing every day. They're moving a little bit more before dark in the evening. They're getting back to bed maybe a little bit later in the morning. So they're moving more. They're just moving more during daylight hours, and you're still in a kind of a bed to feed pattern. This last week of October for me has proven to be some really good deer hunting. So we'll see what happens this year. But thanks for watching, and try and come back again in about a week, and I'll do a week 4 update.